He is the last descendant of a family that came to Jerusalem 13 centuries ago from Medina, a holy city of Islam. His name is Wajid, and he's a Muslim. For reasons lost in time, he continues to carry out a daily ritual assigned to his ancestors more than 1,000 years ago. He, a follower of Allah, is in charge of opening and closing the Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre, a place sacred to the Christian faith. If he were to fall sick, run behind schedule, or forget to perform this daily duty, the church would remain closed, because no one else is allowed to perform this task every morning and evening.
Where is the place called Golgotha mentioned by Mark, or the hill shaped like a skull as Luke refers to it? Where is the garden that John writes about, or the tomb hewn out of the rock that Matthew refers to? We are in the place where those events took place, and yet we feel lost, perhaps because the noonday light that bathed the hill that day, only to be replaced by a darkness that covered the land, and the delicate colors of dawn that tinged the sky the next day, cannot penetrate here. Those events, which took place outdoors on the top of a small hill, are today associated with sites that have been transformed in indoor localities. A fire has been lit under the brazier standing in the courtyard of the nobleman's house. Caiaphas, the high priest, ordered it. It serves to provide light, but even more to warm the people who crowd around it, sharing the latest news. They've already arrested him, someone announces. Not one out of all the people who until recently had listened to Jesus, exclaiming that a great prophet has appeared among us. Not one out of all the people who hung on his words. Not one out of all the people who looked on him as a prophet was there that night.
Excavations have uncovered a flight of steps and architectural remains dating from the Christian era. The church, recently rebuilt on an ancient holy site, is called St. Peter in Gallicantu. It's a reminder of how Peter 3 times denied knowing his master when he was insistently questioned by the servants of Caiaphas and the others who were present in the courtyard that evening.
What happened when Caiaphas met Jesus face to face? A trial? An interrogation? A dress rehearsal for the final accusation?
A new day begins in Jerusalem. Caiaphas seems satisfied. "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" he had asked. "I am," Jesus had answered, sealing his fate. At this point, tearing one's robe was pointless.
The Lord has opened my ear. For my part, I made no resistance, neither did I turn away. I offered my back to those who struck me, my cheeks to those who tore at my beard. I did not cover my face against insult and spittle.
The words of Isaiah resound prophetically. At the time of Jesus, The Roman governors of Palestine had established their headquarters in the coastal city of Caesarea. Large-scale excavations are bringing to light an extensive architectural complex sloping down toward the sea. In the center of the ruins is an amphitheater built to alleviate the boredom of the Romans during their absence from the heart of the empire. Even today, the arena continues to be used for performances. The archaeological excavations, which by now allow visitors to study the ruins in detail, help bring alive for us the words of Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian writing in the 1st century after Christ.
Herod discovered a forgotten coastal settlement known previously as the Tower of Straton. He totally rebuilt the city, covering its buildings with marble and adding a splendid palace. By spending such huge amounts of money, the king succeeded in conquering nature itself.
The place, Caesarea. The time, the mid-1960s. A group of Italian archaeologists are excavating the area around the amphitheater.
They come upon a limestone block, 82 centimeters high, 68 centimeters wide, and 20 centimeters thick. Halfway down the right side of the block, an inscription is still legible: Pontius Pilate, Governor. There is no doubt about it. It is he, Pontius Pilate, the man spoken of in the Gospels, in the writings of Flavius Josephus, and in those of the philosopher Philo.
In Jerusalem, the air is filled with tension. More priests and more of the faithful than usual have flocked to the city.
I bring holocausts to your house, O my God. I bow down toward your holy temple. I give thanks to your name for your love and faithfulness, the Psalms declare.
The sounds made by the stonemasons' tools blend with the voices of men grateful to have a job. 10,000 manual laborers, not counting the more highly skilled artisans. The project is not yet completed, but already Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great, who had inherited a part of his father's extensive kingdom, can rightly be proud of it. This temple is no less imposing than the first one, built by Solomon nearly 1,000 years before, and it's certainly more impressive than the one the prophets Haggai and Zechariah encouraged to be built 500 years later.
The Passover has arrived. For days now, groups of the faithful have been converging on Jerusalem from every corner of Judea, as well as from Samaria and Galilee.
Pilate has also arrived in the city, as he does every year for the festival. On his visit to Jerusalem, he probably stayed in the Antonia fortress, built by Herod just northwest of the temple complex. Or else in the Roman governor's residence in Jerusalem, called the Praetorium, which was located nearby.
The roasting meat, the stalls of the merchants, the narrow alleys and hidden courtyards, known only to the inhabitants of the area, all are a source of worry to the Roman troops. Even Pilate is nervous. There are rumors of insurrection, of the presence of suspicious people in the city. There is even talk of a certain man who has arrived from Judea, a person who attracts crowds and who is claiming to be the Messiah, the Son of God. It is only a short distance from the house of Caiaphas to the Praetorium.
All the chief priests and the elders of the people led Jesus away to hand him over to Pilate, the governor, the only one who had the authority to condemn him to death. They did not enter the praetorium themselves, or they would be defiled and unable to celebrate the Passover, John writes. Jesus had been put in chains by the chief priests, the elders, the scribes, and the entire Sanhedrin. Now he stands before Pilate. Take him yourselves and try him by your own law, Pilate recommends, in an effort to resolve what is rapidly becoming an awkward situation. We are not allowed to put a man to death, reply the members of the Sanhedrin. Are you the king of the Jews? Pilate asks Jesus. Are you a king? He repeats. It is you who say it, but mine is not a kingdom of this world. I find no case against this man, nothing that deserves death.
Herod's residence was probably located in this area, just a few steps from what is now known as the Via Dolorosa, or Street of Sorrows. Although an imposing edifice, it was probably suffocated by the dense warren of shops surrounding it and by the daily traffic of the marketplace. The zone is the same today, even though now the merchandise is different. The position was a strategic one, slightly removed from the main route leading to the temple and the praetorium, but at the same time close enough to keep an eye on one of the most volatile quarters of the city.
Herod was delighted to see Jesus. Why is it that such a shrewd, self-indulgent man, given to the luxuries of life and indifferent to matters of religion, was so eager to see Jesus? Luke says he was hoping to see him work a miracle, one of the wonders that had been attributed to him and about which Herod had heard. That was all that interested him. He questioned Jesus at length, but received no reply, a silence loaded with dignity and reproach. Herod and his guards put a rich cloak on Jesus, their vulgar jokes and laughter lending an even more cruel note to the sorrowful scene. Then Jesus was sent back to Pilate to receive his sentence, the final decision regarding his fate.
Lithostratos means flagstone pavement. Gabbatha, an Aramaic word, can be translated as height or perhaps knob. The pavement was uncovered during excavation work under the convent of the Sisters of Zion, located on Jerusalem's Via Dolorosa. Part of the pavement is beneath the convent, while another part of it is located next to the Church of the Flagellation. The stones have been worn smooth by the constant passage of carts. Here and there, graffiti have been scratched into the stones, but it's hard to decipher their meaning. Perhaps they are traces of games played by the Roman soldiers to pass the time when they were not making their rounds or on guard duty. Antonia Fortress, Pilate's residence, was at one time located on this site, so perhaps the pavement is the one on which Jesus stood during his trial before Pilate.
Pilate had Jesus brought out and seated himself on the chair of judgment. The Gospels tell us no more. The trial resumes. Pilate repeats that he has found no evidence of wrongdoing in this man, a judgment similar to that of Herod, who had sent Jesus back to him. But the chief priests, the authorities, and the people continue to insist, once, twice, and yet a third time. Pilate offers to free Jesus rather than Barabbas, a man who had been imprisoned for rioting and murder. Which do you want me to release for you? They shout, Barabbas! And what of Jesus? Crucify him! Crucify him! The roar resounds throughout the Praetorium. At that point, Pilate decides to grant their demand. He released the man they asked for, who had been imprisoned for rioting and murder, and handed Jesus over them to deal with as they pleased.
아버지 하나님, 이제 저희들도 주님 곁에서 언제나 주님을 보좌하며 주님과 한 길을 걸어갈 수 있는
To reach the site of his death, Jesus had to climb to the top of a hill, bearing a heavy cross on his shoulders. Like their predecessors, modern-day pilgrims follow a street through Jerusalem that leads to Mount Calvary. Christian devotional practice has established points of reference along the route, called the Stations of the Cross. These small, unpretentious chapels illustrate the most dramatic moments of the final journey of Jesus. Archaeologists raise questions as to whether or not the route followed by modern pilgrims is actually the one that Jesus used. But scholarly debates have had little impact on a devotional practice by now centuries old. If one were to follow a straight line, it would only be about 300 meters from Pilate's house to the Holy Sepulchre. But along the narrow, winding street, the distance is about 700 meters. Whichever route Jesus actually took, the memory and significance of his final trip live on in the actions of pilgrims today, who seek to relive its most dramatic moments.
The cruel and merciless scourging Jesus underwent at the hands of the Roman soldiers in the Praetorium, who had tipped their lashes with bits of bone or lead. The mocking signs of royalty accorded him by the governor's soldiers, the scarlet cloak, the crown of thorns, the reed they placed in his hands. The ridicule and insults of the crowd that lined the route followed by Jesus and the Roman soldiers. The unexpected moment when Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the fields, was pressed into service to carry the cross for a short distance, since by that time Jesus no longer had the strength to carry it himself. The soldiers brought Jesus to a place called Golgotha in Hebrew, which means the place of the skull, and there they crucified him.
In June 1968, in the Givat HaMiftar neighborhood in northeastern Jerusalem, archaeologists discovered 9 Jewish tombs dating from the 1st century AD. The bones of the deceased were found in little stone chests, a total of 35 people, 5 of whom had suffered violent deaths. One of the bodies discovered, that of a young man named Jehohanatan, bears the signs of crucifixion. At the time of his death, he was anywhere from 24 to 28 years old and stood 1.67 meters tall.
His heels were both pierced by a single iron nail 17 centimeters long, so deeply embedded in his flesh that it was impossible to remove when he was buried. The single nail was used to anchor both his feet to the vertical beam of the cross, with his legs placed together and bent at the knees. Nailed to the cross, the condemned man suffered terrible convulsions. Because his arms were brutally outstretched, his blood was not able to circulate properly. Cramps and suffocation slowly blocked the action of his heart and lungs until he was finally unable to move at all. And while all this was happening, the victim was still fully conscious. Probably Jesus suffered the same torture as Yehohanatan, his contemporary and countryman. Just inside the Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre, a steep staircase on the right leads up to a small chapel. It's known as the Chapel of the Holy Cross, or of St. Helena. Here too, as in other places, the original ground has been covered. Here, as elsewhere, every trace of history has become the prisoner of scrupulously defined visitors' schedules. In this place, it's hard to enjoy a moment unmarked by conflicting liturgical chants, by the odor of different types of incense, and by a sacred atmosphere conditioned by the most rigid rules. And yet, it's enough to move just a short distance away, and everything changes. Over here, the temperature abruptly drops several degrees. The lamps illuminate a sizable space, the boundaries of which cannot be clearly discerned. To one side is an outcrop of rock. Our pilgrimage is over. We see before us the site on which the drama of Jesus' crucifixion took place 2,000 years ago. This is the Rock of Golgotha, terrible in its power to re-evoke that event with such immediacy. The continuous recitation of psalms, the hymns and prayers of liturgical ceremonies, all echo throughout the basilica, but they do not carry as far as this rock. Here, there is only silence, more eloquent than any liturgy.
It was the third hour when they crucified him. And they crucified 2 robbers with him, one on his right and one on his left. The people entering or leaving Jerusalem pass beneath the cross of Jesus and interpret the scene in different ways. The Roman soldiers passed the time by throwing dice for the clothes of Jesus. But something unusual takes place in those hours. It was now about the 6th hour, and with the sun eclipsed, a darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour, the hour of Jesus' death.
At that moment, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, my God, why have you abandoned me?"
His cry is awe-inspiring, the expression of a suffering that is tearing his body apart to penetrate the depths of his heart. But it's also the beginning of a prayer. In you, our fathers put their trust. says the psalm, and you rescued them. They called to you for help, and they were saved. They never trusted you in vain.
At the moment of tragic defeat, a miracle of faith begins to unfold. In the temple, the veil that conceals the Holy of Holies is torn in two. Someone, perhaps without realizing it, takes the first step toward the faith that leads to salvation.
In truth, this man was the Son of God, declared the centurion who stood before the cross.
The women who watch from afar stand frozen, absolutely silent. At the foot of the cross are the mother of Jesus and his disciple, John. The innocent one suffers and dies to bring hope to the world.
This is my body, which will be given up for you. This is my blood, the blood of the covenant, which is to be poured out for many.
The Shabbat, the Jewish Sabbath, has already begun, and the obligation to rest takes effect. The evening shadows seem to emphasize the strange silence which hangs over the city. Joseph of Arimathea, a rich Jew and prominent member of the Sanhedrin, courageously goes to Pilate to ask for the body of Jesus. It is turned over to him once the centurion has verified that Jesus is truly dead. Some women prepare spices and ointments with which to anoint his tortured limbs after the Sabbath rest. Taken down from the cross, the body of Jesus is wrapped in a shroud bought by Joseph of Arimathea for that purpose. Joseph opens a tomb carved out of a rock located on a piece of property he owns just a short distance from Calvary. The body of Jesus is placed in this tomb in which no one had yet been laid. A rock is rolled across the entrance. The next day, the chief priests and Pharisees visit the tomb so as to seal the rock and appoint guards to watch over it for fear his disciples would come and steal him away and tell the people he has risen from the dead. Jesus' life on earth seems to end like that of every other human being, in a grave.
The Sabbath passes. No activity is noted around the tomb that day. But the day after the Sabbath, the women went to the tomb with the spices they had prepared. It was very early in the morning. They found that the stone had been rolled away from the tomb, but on entering discovered that the body of the Lord Jesus was not there. Mark writes that the women saw a man dressed in white. Luke says that there were two men, and Matthew records that the women saw an angel who told them that Jesus had risen from the dead.
News of the resurrection begins to spread. Filled with awe and great joy, the women came quickly away from the tomb and ran to tell the disciples.
In Jerusalem, life goes on as usual. The last of the pilgrims who have come to celebrate the Passover linger in the small shops, in the narrow, winding streets, and in the usual gathering places.
The memory of the man who had been crucified and of the mysterious events which accompanied his execution has already begun to fade from the mind of the public. The disciples of Jesus are hiding in a safe place, afraid to show themselves for fear of the Jews. They are sad and confused, in spite of the joyous news they received from the women. The empty tomb remains a mystery.
That very same day, 2 of Jesus' disciples were on their way to a village called Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem, and they were talking together about all that had happened. Now as they talked this over, Jesus himself came up and walked by their side. But something prevented them from recognizing him, and he began to converse with them.
In the evening of that same day, the first day of the week, the doors were closed in the room where the disciples were for fear of the Jews. Jesus came and stood among them. He said to them, "Peace be with you," and showed them his hands and his side. The disciples were filled with joy when they saw the Lord.
Jesus came up and spoke to them. He said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore, make disciples of all the nations, baptize them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teach them to observe all the commands I gave you. And know that I am with you always, yes, to the end of time."
From that moment on, the disciples would ardently proclaim the mystery of the resurrection. They would also fulfill the command to travel to the ends of the earth to announce this event, and, if necessary, would witness to its truth by giving up their lives. Because there are messages like the one proclaimed by Jesus that turn a person's entire existence upside down, and that justify coming to this place to retrace the paths that still bear the signs of his passion and death.
And so, Mark concludes, they went out and preached everywhere, destined to conquer the world because they had been freed from fear.
I want to remind you, my friends, that in those days there lived a wise man named Jesus. He was a good man, one respected for his way of life. Many people, both Jews and those of other nations, became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to crucifixion and death. But his disciples continued to follow his teaching. They said that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Perhaps he was the Messiah, of whom the prophets had foretold many wonders.
Flavius Josephus, writing from Rome in the year 93 AD.